time for story time. By the time the Hardy Boys and Chet had raced from the Morton's kitchen, the prowler was not in sight. Thinking he had run across one of the fields, the three pursuers scattered in various directions to search. Joe struck out straight ahead and pressed his ear to the ground to listen for receding footsteps. He could hear none. Presently, the three boys met once more to discuss their failure to catch up to the man and to question why he had been there. "Do you think he was a thief?" Joe asked Chet. "What would he steal?" "Search me," the stout boy replied. "Let's take a look." "I believe he was carrying something, but I couldn't see what it was," Frank revealed. The barn door had not been closed yet for the night, and the boys walked in. Chet turned on the lights, and the searchers gazed around. "Look!" Frank cried suddenly. He pointed to the floor below the telephone extension in the barn. There lay a man's gray wig. "The intruders!" Joe exclaimed. "It sure looks so," Frank agreed, "and something must have scared him. In his hurry to get away, he must have dropped this." Frank picked up the wig and examined it carefully for a clue. No identifying mark in it. "Say, I have an idea," he burst out. "That man phoned you from here, Chet." "You mean he's the one who threatened me?" "Yes, if you know how. You can call your own telephone number from an extension." "That's right." Chet was wagging his head. "You mean that guy bothered to come all the way here to use this phone to threaten me? Why?" Both Hardys said they felt the man had not come specifically for that reason. There was another more important one. "We must figure it out. Chet, you ought to be able to answer that better than anybody else. What is there, or was there, in this barn to interest such a person?" The stout boy scratched his head and let his eyes wander around the building. "It wouldn't be any of the livestock," he said slowly. "And it couldn't be hay or feed." Suddenly Chet snapped his fingers. "Maybe I have the answer. Wait a minute, fellas." And on the floor lay a man's wig. He disappeared from the barn and made a beeline for the garage. Chet hurried inside, but was back in a few seconds. "I have it," he shouted. "That guy came here to get the spare tire for the jalopy." "The one you had is gone?" Frank asked. Chet nodded. He suggested that perhaps the man was not too far away. He might be on some side road changing the tire. "Let's find out," he urged. Although the Hardys felt that it would be a useless search, they agreed to go along. They got on their motorcycles, with Chet riding behind Joe. The boys went up one road and down another, covering the territory very thoroughly. They saw no parked car. "Not even any evidence that a driver pulled off the road and stayed to change a tire," Frank remarked. "No footprints, no tool marks, no treads. That guy must have had somebody around to pick him up," Chet concluded with a sigh. "Cheer up, Chet," Frank said as they walked back to the house. "That spare tire may turn out to be a clue in this case." When the boys entered the kitchen again, they were met with anxious inquiries from Callie and Iola. "What in the world were you doing, dashing out of here without a word?" Callie asked in a shaking voice. "Yes, what's going on?" "You had us frightened silly," Iola joined in. "First Chet gets a threatening phone call, and then suddenly all three of you run out of the house like madmen." "Calm down, girls," Frank says soothingly. "I saw a prowler, and we were looking for him, but all we found was this." And he tossed the gray wig onto a chair in the hall. Suddenly there was a loud wail from Chet. "My Welsh rabbit! It's been standing so long it will be ruined." Iola began to giggle. "Oh, you man," she said. "Do you suppose Callie and I would let all that good cheese go to waste? We kept that Welsh rabbit at just the right temperature, and it isn't spoiled at all." Chet looked relieved as he and the others took their places at the table. Although there was a great deal of bantering during the meal, the conversation in the main revolved around Chet's missing jalopy and the thief who evidently wore hair disguises to suit his fancy. Frank and Joe asked Chet if they might take along the gray wig and examine it more thoroughly. There might be some kind of mark on it to indicate either the maker or the owner. Chet readily agreed. But when supper was over, Callie said to Frank with a teasing gleam in her eyes, "Why don't you hotshot sleuths examine that wig now? I'd like to watch your super-duper methods." "Just for that, I will," said Frank. He went to get the wig from the hall chair and then laid it on the kitchen table. From his pocket, he took a small magnifying glass and carefully examined every inch of the lining of the wig. Nothing here, he said presently. The hair was thoroughly examined and patted strand by strand to see if there were any identifying designations on the hairpiece. Frank could discover nothing. I'm afraid this isn't going to help us much, he said in disgust, but I'll show it to the different wig men in town. As he finished speaking, the telephone rang and Iola went to answer it. Chet turned white and looked nervous. Was the caller the man who had threatened him? And what did he want? Presently, Iola returned to the kitchen, a worried frown on her face. It's a man for you, Chet. He wouldn't give his name. Trembling visibly, Chet walked slowly to the telephone. The others followed and listened. Yes, I'm Chet Morton. No, I haven't got my car back. There was a long silence as the person on the other end of the line spoke rapidly. But I haven't any money, Chet said finally. Well, okay, I'll let you know. Chet hung up and wobbled to a nearby chair. The others bombarded him with questions. The stout boy took a deep breath, then said, I can get my jalopy back, but the man wants a lot of money for the information as to where it is. Oh, I'm glad you're going to get your car back, Callie exclaimed. But I haven't got any money, Chet groaned. Who's the man? Frank demanded. There was another long pause before Chet answered. Then, looking at the waiting group before him, he announced simply, Smuff, Oscar Smuff. His listeners gasped in astonishment. This was the last thing they expected to hear. The detective was selling information as to where Chet would find his missing jalopy? Why, that cheap so-and-so, Joe cried out angrily. Chet explained that Smuff had said he was not in business for his health. He had to make a living, and any information which he dug up as a detective should be properly paid for. Frank shrugged. I suppose Smuff has a point there. How much does he want for the information, Chet? His fee is $25. What? The others cried out. After a long consultation, it was decided that the young people would pool the resources. Whatever sum they would collect toward the $25 would be offered to Oscar Smuff to lead them to Chet's car. But make it very plain, Frank admonished, that if it's not your jalopy Smuff leads us to, you won't pay him one nickel. Chet put in a call to Smuff's home. As expected, the detective grumbled at the offer of $10, but finally accepted it. He said he would pick up the boys in half an hour and take them to the spot. About this time, Mr. and Mrs. Morton returned home. Chet, and Iola's father, was a good-looking, jolly man with his son's same general build and coloring. He was in the real estate business in Bayport and ran the farm as a hobby. Mrs. Morton was an older edition of her daughter, Iola, and just as witty and light-hearted. But when she learned what had transpired and that her son had been threatened, she was worried. You boys must be very careful, Mrs. Morton advised. From what I hear about Smuff, this red-haired thief could easily put one over on him, so watch your step. Chet promised that they would. Good luck, Callie called out as Smuff beeped his horn outside the door. And don't be too late. I want to hear the news before I have to go home. Frank, Joe, and Chet found Smuff entirely uncommunicative about where they were going. He seemed to enjoy the role he was playing. I knew I'd be the one to break this case, he boasted. Joe could not resist the temptation of asking Smuff if he was going to lead them to the thief as well as to the car. The detective, flushed in embarrassment, admitted that he did not have full details yet on this part of the mystery. But it won't be long before I capture that fellow, he assured the boys. They managed to keep their faces straight and only hoped that they were not now on a wild goose chase. 20 minutes later, Smuff pulled into the town of Ducksworth and drove straight to a used car lot. Stopping, he announced, Well, here we are. Get ready to fork over that money, Chet. Smuff nodded to the attendant in charge, then led the boys down a long aisle past row after row of cars to where several jalopies were lined up against a rear fence. Turning left, the detective finally paused before a bright red car. Here you are, said Smuff grandly, extending his right hand toward Chet. My money, please. The stout boy, as well as the Hardys, stared at the jalopy. There was no question but that it was the same make and model as Chet's. The thief thought he could disguise it by painting it red, Smuff explained. Is that your guess? Frank asked quietly. Oscar Smuff frowned. How else could you figure it? He asked. Then there'll be yellow paint under the red, Frank went on. Let's take a look to make sure. It was evident that Smuff did not like this procedure, So you doubt me, eh? He asked in an unpleasant tone. Anybody can get fooled, Frank told him. Well, Chet, let's operate on this car. And the detective stood by sullenly as Frank pulled out a penknife and began to scrape the red paint off part of the fender. And that's the end of the chapter. Next, it's time for the Great Flood from Genesis chapter 5. Adam and Eve's children lived to be very old. They had children, grandchildren, great-grandchildren, and many great-great-grandchildren. As the years passed, there were more and more people in the world. Most of them were very wicked. Yet there was one man who tried to please God. This man was Enoch. He walked with God, talked to God, and listened when God spoke to him. Because Enoch loved God most of all, he did not die. Instead, when he became old, God took him to heaven. Enoch's son, Methuselah, was the oldest man who ever lived. He lived to be 969 years old. By this time, there were many, many people in the world. Their hearts were full of sin. They did not try to please God, for they did not love him. They did not teach their children to love the good and do the right. Everywhere there was sin and wrongdoing. What a sad world. How sorry God was that he had made man. The people were no longer fit to live. Finally, God decided the only way to get rid of sin and wickedness in the world was to cover the earth with a great flood. Then God remembered Noah. Even among these wicked people, Noah tried to do right. He taught his sons to do right also. This pleased God. Sometimes God talked to Noah. Now he told Noah about his plan to destroy the world. He promised Noah and his family that they would not be destroyed with the wicked. Build an ark, God told Noah. When it is finished, you and your wife and your sons and their wives may go into the ark. You will live there until the flood is over. God decided to save a pair of each kind of living thing. These would also stay in the ark during the flood. Because Noah believed God, he began building the ark. God had told him how it should be built. While the people went their wicked way, Noah and his sons made the ark as God had said. It looked like a 3-story houseboat perched up on dry land. Now the people must have laughed at Noah and his 3 sons. They must have thought Noah and his sons were crazy. Where was the water for their boat? Again and again, Noah warned the people to repent of their sins, or they would be destroyed in the flood. None of them believed him. When everything was ready, God told Noah to take into the ark his wife, his 3 sons, and their wives. Then God caused 2 of every kind of animal, bird, and creeping thing to go into the ark. 7 pairs of each kind of useful birds and animals came. When all were inside, God shut the door. After a few days, the rain began to fall, and such a rain. Great sheets of water poured down from the clouds. Soon the tiny streams were raging and the rivers were overflowing their banks. People left their homes and rushed to the hills for safety. Animals ran pell-mell trying to find refuge and shelter. Still it rained. Higher and higher the waters rose. Now the people knew Noah had told the truth. For 40 days and nights it rained. Only Noah and his family were safe. The waters lifted the ark off the ground, and the ark began to float. For more than 6 months it floated. Then one day it stood still on top of a mountain. After waiting for some time, Noah opened a window and let out a raven. This bird had strong wings and could fly about until the waters had gone down. Several days later, Noah sent out a dove. The dove returned because she could not find a place to build her nest. Here's a picture of it. A week later, Noah sent the dove out again. She stayed longer this time. When evening came, she flew back, bringing a green olive leaf in her mouth. Now Noah and his family knew the land was becoming green and beautiful. The next week, when Noah sent out the dove, she flew away and never came back. Now Noah believed it was time to uncover the ark and look out upon the earth. How glad he must have been to see dry land again. For more than a year, they had been inside the ark. God said to Noah, "Come out of the ark with your wife and your sons and their wives and every living thing that is in the ark." Noah opened the great door. He and his family stepped out on dry ground. All the animals, the birds, and the creeping things came out. Noah was thankful to be alive. As soon as he came out of the ark, he built an altar and made his offering to God. God accepted the offering and was pleased with Noah and his family. God promised that he would never again send another flood to destroy every living creature. God said, "As long as the earth remains, there will be summer and winter, springtime and autumn, and day and night." To remind men of his promise, God made the rainbow in the sky. And this picture is in black and white, but it's supposed to be showing you the rainbow in the sky. And that's it.